15, I think you were sort of trying to get me to go somewhere with this. And I think Kevin's kind of. But when we look around and we see the way in which Kevin has used imagery from even the 50s and 40s, I mean, Fats Waller and people like that.
Yes.
And, I mean, that clearly speaks to how in the influence of other arts, you know, like photography, like graphic art and design, started to be integrated into the whole of the popular musical system, as well as theatre and dance and so on. So its impact is enormous. It may not necessarily be about beating time on your jog or you know, strumming your drum. No, you don't strum drums, do you? Because you're a drummer, aren't you? So I think it's all around us, isn't it? I mean, even look at this artwork here, discography, which is at the back of every pop book that's ever written about any significant pop artist. There's a discography, isn't there?
That's right.
And here's one.
Yes.
You know. So these are ways in which the visual arts integrate some of the real impact of the 60s going forward, I think, anyway.
One thing that I do want to bring up is that in terms of the sort of cross-pollination between art and music, you know, I knew about Stuart Sutcliffe the first time I read what was his name, Davies, the first Hunter Davies book. I mean, everybody I knew that was a musician had this book when I was about a junior in high school. It's the first Beatles book. The Beatles were still together when they wrote it, and Stuart, I became familiar with him then, but I didn't really know about his artwork until I went online and saw the website. I wanted to say that three of the biggest influences for me of people that were musicians and visual artists, Ron Nagel, who's a great ceramic sculptor and put out a couple of rock records in the early 60s. He lives in California. He's considered one of the best at what he does with ceramic sculpture in the world. There's Don Van Vliet, who was known as Captain Beefheart, who is a terrific painter and had a great career as a recording artist, and then basically now mostly just paints and sculpts. I think primarily paints. And Teare Allen, who is a printmaker and a sculptor, and I think you know, he has this group called the Panhandle Mystery Band, and he's done these great country and western albums about the art scene, and it's a very sort of you know, it's about how highfalutin the New York art scene is, you know, and it's well, he has one record called Lubbock on Everything. He's originally from Lubbock, Texas. So this always attracted me. I like that they could do both. You know, there's a huge push in the arts, particularly in the New York sort of gallery system. And I'm not putting it down. I'm just saying this is the way it is. They like to see you do the same thing over and over again. And some people can do this more successfully than others. And I don't think that in general they really like to see you start playing drums and things. But you know, it can't be helped. You know, if you feel moved by music and you love to paint, there's really no, I mean, why fight it? You know, life's short.
But you know, in the 50s at art school, Kevin, it wasn't allowed. You weren't allowed to like both. You know, the music was regarded as trivial and meaningless, and no serious artist could possibly be interested in such stuff. They just about allowed jazz. Jazz was okay. When folk came along, that was sort of okay, but not rock and roll, and certainly not Elvis Presley. Pity.
Well, since you had brought up becoming familiar with Stuart Sutcliffe's work, I wanted to ask you, Pauline, how do you feel that your brother's work was a reflection of the times or a sign of things to come a few years later? Can you position him in a certain change that was occurring at that time?
First of all, I have to say that I'm not educated in the arts beyond having been raised with an awful lot of artworks and music and so on around me. I'm a psychotherapist. Well, that's a kind of art too, I suppose. But it's an interesting question, Christine, because it's not often known that Stuart actually went to college at the age of 16, which, of course, is 2 years ahead, at least. You don't go to university till you're 18 plus. And so, you know, he was doing a lot of growing up in the first couple of years, and he was still exploring the whole world of even just the history of art. His notebooks and sketchbooks have lots of notes in them about how to use paint and what colours are opaque and what colours are clear and how to mix this with that. And so the whole business of the technical side of art was clearly something of a preoccupation for him for many years. In fact, all the stuff that isn't taught today, mostly in art schools, was taught back then. Also, other notebooks have lots of anatomy drawings. So they were taught all the structure of the body and movement and so on. So as an academic training, there was nothing better than that. Now, when it came to how he was influenced, there's an essay, an unfinished essay, for example, in the collection, where he's comparing Cézanne to Pollock. Now, that's a mind blower, isn't it? And very interesting, too. But as a young man, he was very, very intrigued, initially, early on, with the pre-Raphaelites. Mm-hmm. And I think that was much more to do with the idea that one integrated the arts, because he was also a poet, Stuart, and an essayist, and a lyricist, of course. And in fact, they formed a group at art school, 4 of them, called the Dissenters, which is quite an adolescent idea, I guess. But, you know, he was only 16. And it doesn't matter how intellectually brave and bright he was. I mean, he was still a very young boy. So he was interested in the pre-Raphaelites, not just for their artworks, but for their philosophy and their poetry and so on. And, interestingly enough, at a time when they were going out of fashion. Similarly, when his work moved through a number of different, you know, growing phases and phases of influence, he became interested in the European abstract expressionists when they were going out of fashion. So he was either stupid, which he wasn't, or he was onto something. He didn't want to let go of those great art movements when in their place was what was coming in was pop art. Now, he ended up doing his master's with one of the forerunners of pop art in Europe, Edoardo Palozzi, who was his tutor. So it's interesting, A, to read his notes about working with Edoardo, but also the influence of Edoardo's work on Stuart's work, which is, I'm sure, Kevin, you can see just how evident Palozzi's influence is. You know, the very